Welcome to Go Solo Live.
Don't you mean go solo live? Have you ever been asked why on earth would you travel alone? Go Solo Live not only answers that question, but celebrates life as a midlife solo traveler. This is a safe place for women to come together to reminisce about their travels, encourage others to travel, and to dig into the real lessons learned from these journeys. Now join Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel as she and her guests share stories of the solo travelers of midlife women.
Hello, sisters, and welcome to Go Solo Live. This is Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel. It's time to sit back and grab a cup of coffee and enjoy my conversation with Amy Scott of Nomadtopia. She's going to share her accidental solo travel story. Joining me today is Amy Scott from Nomadtopia, and she is currently in Mexico. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer.
Thanks for being here. And so where are you exactly right now?
I'm in San Miguel de Allende, which is in kind of the middle of the country. They call it the Central Highlands, and it's about 3 or 4 hours north of Mexico City.
Fantastic. So how did you land there at this point?
Well, my husband and I have been traveling more or less full-time for a couple of years and realized that, for example, we were trudging across Chiang Mai in Thailand trying to go to this Mexican restaurant. And we're always doing things like that in different countries. And finally I was like, why are we skipping over Mexico? Why don't we just go to the source? And we both love Mexican food. And, we thought, yeah, let's do that. And I had been researching destinations, and there was actually someone I connected with on Twitter, actually, who lives in San Miguel. And I sent her some questions on email, and we started chatting, and she suggested we come check it out. And now we've been, this is kind of now our unofficial base. We've spent about a year and a half of the last 2.5 years here.
Fantastic. Mm-hmm. Well, so we're going to rewind the clock just a little bit. And I'd like you to tell me a little bit about how did you get started with doing travel, and especially, of course, the solo travel?
So it all kind of happened in one big splash. With many people, I grew up traveling a lot, had done, your typical 2-week vacations, usually with my boyfriend or to visit family. But then in my late 20s, I got this crazy idea to take a round the world trip, which I didn't even know was really a thing. And then I started researching and found out it was a thing. And luckily my boyfriend at the time was on board. We started planning somewhere between like a 6 and 9 month trip. So the plan was quit our jobs, save money, quit our jobs, and take this trip. And I was obsessed with the planning, with the saving, reading everything I could get my hands on. And somewhere along the way, he decided he didn't want to go, and decided, and I'm not sure which came first exactly, but it basically led to the end of the relationship. And, looking back, I'm actually really grateful that, he never said, we can't go, or I don't want to go and neither should you. It wasn't, I think he knew that it was something that was really important to me. And so he just kind of took himself out of the picture instead of ever expecting me to compromise about it, And when I think back on that time, I'm grateful that really wasn't a decision I had to make. And so it's like, okay, well, basically, okay, it's going to be a solo trip. What does that look like? And because this was I think I was about a year and a half into planning at that point. I was in.
You were fully vested at that point.
Yes, exactly. And I think, maybe for 5 minutes it crossed my mind, maybe I shouldn't do this, but it was on. And so I just, I continued with my saving, really it was more the saving that was taking so long. The planning doesn't have to take so long. And then finally after 2.5 years after I first came up with the idea, I packed up my backpack, sold almost all my stuff and quit my job and set off. And that was in 2004.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Okay. So, again, we talked about this off air before we got started, but a lot of people begin solo travel as an accidental solo traveler, sort of like your story, where I was going to go with a family member, a friend, a boyfriend, and next thing I know, they're not going. And there's this decision point to, it's really a pivotal turning point for people.
Definitely.
And you're talking to people all the time in Nomadtopia. And I know you're not just focusing on solo travelers, but you're also working with people who are in this turning point type of situation. What do you think is the difference between somebody saying, oh no, I can't go, versus I'm ready to go solo?
That's a great question. I think part of it is what I described, being fully vested. That was a great phrase for it. Being so in at that point that you really just can't imagine backing out. Like, okay, this is going to look different, but I'm going to find a way. And I think also there's kind of a confidence around it that even if there maybe was some comfort in the idea of having a travel partner, that you still trust that you can handle it, that it's going to be a positive experience, etc., to the point that, that fear or that lack of confidence isn't going to hold you back. And, and that's something you can certainly start to develop if you're at that turning point and it's either, well, I go or I don't go. I think that's part of it too. When you start to, if you're really excited about this trip and then you find out it's now either I go or I don't go, like I couldn't imagine what it would be like to not go at that point. Right. And so if you picture those are your two options, it's like, just go for it. Otherwise you miss out on this opportunity, or you're waiting around for someone to change their mind or someone new to come along. I've never regretted taking the leap on my own.
Well, and again, once we start waiting, it just might never happen.
Right.
But what's interesting as well is once we've invested that time and that money and the effort in planning, every time we're increasing our anticipation of it, we have that excitement level. That's a commitment in a way. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, it's a commitment to the trip. It's also a commitment to ourselves. And so when that situation happened, about how old were you?
I think, when we broke up, I was 28 and I was 29 when I left on the trip.
So what was the reaction when you shared with friends and family that this has now changed from going with a partner, and that partner is a man,
right,
to now going alone?
I don't think there was too much of a different reaction. Maybe again, because I had been talking about it for so long that, my family, my friends knew how invested I was, and they probably weren't surprised that it was still a go. I have a vague recollection of having a conversation with my parents, just about, how I might make some adjustments. Like, for example, and I hate to malign any particular country, but I remember with my boyfriend, one of the countries we'd come up with on our itinerary was Morocco, which was the closest I'd ever gotten to, a less Western culture and maybe less tolerant to solo women and that sort of thing. And so that was the one place that had been on my list that I took off the list. And so I feel like there was maybe a conversation with my parents about, I am kind of thinking these things through, and I haven't done this before. And so I'm going to make some choices about where I go, which I think gave them, and they also know that I've always been, I have a good head on my shoulders and I can take care of myself. I've lived in big cities my whole life, et cetera.
Sure.
So, I think that conversation and just them knowing my personality in general gave them the confidence that, that I was going to be fine.
Absolutely. And that's helpful. So the other question is, did anybody offer to go with you? Because sometimes it depends on how we are interacting in how we tell the story about, is the story, my boyfriend ditched me and we broke up, and so now I have to do this on my own? Or is the story, well, his loss on all counts.
Right.
And I'm going to go do this for me because this is a great option for me to have. What was your story like?
Definitely more the latter, I think. Like this is going to be an amazing experience. Like, what is he thinking? He doesn't want to take a trip like this. Are you kidding me? I did have a couple friends. I actually kind of forgot about this. I did have a couple people come meet me along the way.
Okay.
For short periods, like they had limited vacation time, so they would come for like a week or two. And I assume that came about in, like in that last year of planning once it became a solo trip. So for example, and their only place that I think I maybe actually sought it out was for my arrival in India. I think India was the one place that was still on my itinerary that I was feeling, a little nervous about. I've heard it's a really tough country to travel in. And so I asked a couple of friends from college if they wanted to come meet me. Or maybe they mentioned it that they wanted to go to India. I don't know. But anyway, we ended up meeting there. I think I traveled with them for the first week or two of my time there. And it did help me just kind of ease my entry a bit. And then I felt more confident continuing on my own after that.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And there's no rules. We are creating the rules. So there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just, we get to choose. And because you've chosen once, you can still change your mind and choose something differently too.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that. I think that you've made, again, you had a concern about an area, you made a choice, you made an offer, and you addressed it. So you were still able to go.
Yep.
So let's talk about some of your best experiences on that first trip. What did you love? We're going to talk about what you loved and then what you learned. So feel free to dig in either way.
Okay. So, it's funny. I get asked a lot, especially in the early days after that trip, got asked what was my favorite place. And I feel like what I loved overall varies so much depending on which piece of it you're asking me about. Like for nature, I loved Patagonia in South America. For food, I probably loved India. For architecture, maybe Thailand, so like it depends. Like I feel like there's not one place that I loved for all of those reasons, right?
Good.
Yeah. And actually one of my very first experiences was definitely a highlight, which was doing the Inca Trail from in Peru up to Machu Picchu. That was an incredible experience. Yeah. And hard to beat, really. And I had a friend come join me for that too, actually. A friend who was actually heading out on her own solo trip. And it turned out we both really wanted to go to Machu Picchu. So she met me there and we did just maybe 10 days together.
Perfect. And how long were you gone overall? You said you were originally planning to be gone for 6 to 9 months?
Yeah, it ended up somewhere between 8 and 9, like 8.5 maybe.
Okay. And how firm was your plans?
Yeah.
I mean, are you the planner where it's day to day? Is it something that you loosely figured out as you went? What was the balance?
Yeah, kind of a mix. It really was a balance because I felt pretty strongly that I didn't want to be, for example, in a situation where I really needed to get a flight or really needed to get somewhere for some reason and flights were like an astronomical amount of money or something.
Absolutely.
So I decided to just book, I assume they're still around. There's this company called Airtrex, Treks, which actually specializes in round the world trips. And so I had them help me just with the long haul flights.
Yes.
And with the idea that it would leave me flexibility in the middle. So for example, I flew from San Francisco to Lima and then had a ticket out of Buenos Aires, passing back through the States to go to India.
Okay.
And then I think from India, maybe I flew into Mumbai and out of Delhi. And then that took me to Bangkok. And then I just had a flight in and out of Bangkok. So I did all of Southeast Asia from there. And then from Bangkok to London and then London to New York. So
do you understand how this all sounds when we're talking about this, right? If somebody was trying to sit there with a map and a pen tracking what you just did.
Yeah.
It can be a little bit mind-blowing and overwhelming and exciting and exhilarating all at once.
Yeah.
So how did the planning process work for you then in that
Yeah.
space?
You mean to even narrow it down to those
Right.
locations? Yeah. I remember, a fair amount of that was fleshed out in early days with my boyfriend. And then, as I said, I made some tweaks. But
Mhm.
we were looking at, so we lived in San Francisco at the time. So that was obviously going to be our starting point. We definitely looked at weather in different places.
Sure.
And so in terms of like, do we go to Asia first? Because, San Francisco to Asia is kind of handy. Or are we going to do it the other way around? And
so it's easy to come home.
Yeah, exactly. And then, and actually the funny thing is I didn't technically go all the way around the world. I didn't cross the Pacific because I went all the way to Asia and then flew back to London. So yeah, but
details.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have to actually disclose that.
That's right. And yeah, and for whatever reason, again, I guess partly because of weather, and also I think I worked backwards a bit too. There was something happening in my family in May, so I knew I wanted to be back and done by May.
Done.
And so I kind of
not
worked
just back. You were that was the end.
Yeah, the end of the trip. And so I think working back from there, I figured on September being a good time to leave. And then we're heading into winter, so I should probably go south, which is how I ended up doing South America first. And then I actually came home for the holidays because I had to go through the States to go to India anyway. And my parents lived in New Jersey at the time, so I flew from Buenos Aires back to New York, which actually I will mention, and for anyone thinking about doing the same, I found it very, very difficult to break up my trip like that. It really
important advice.
Yeah, it disrupted the momentum. And of course it was nice to be home. It was nice to, repack my bag and see family. But I remember feeling like it was really, really hard to get on that next plane to India.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And then, of course, once I got back in the groove, it was fine. But I remember that being a really tough transition.
I think that's a really good point because a lot of us think like, okay, well, we can multitask our trips, but you do lose some of that vibe that you have. And certainly, again, it's one thing to be an independent traveler, but I feel like sometimes when you go home, you revert back to whatever your typical home role is.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just went from like, I am exploring the world to, and now I'm at home in my parents' place for a holiday. And this is how, it's a different version of a reality check.
Totally.
And not bad, just different.
Yeah.
So, as you were coming down from that, one of the things that I like to talk to people about, maybe you had a bit of this when you came home for the holiday, but what was your re-entry like as you were, you coming down after this trip of independence and freedom and not being tied down to the 9-to-5 job, and you're coming home and there's still no relationship on the horizon. I'm not going to say there was no romance, but there was
actually, that's a whole other story we can get into if you want.
We might need to do that.
Okay.
But what was that coming home or coming down experience like for you?
Yeah, that was something, I'm not sure why. I actually am kind of proud of myself for having the wherewithal to realize that was going to be a challenge. And I actually made a point, so I was going to stop in London for just like a week on my way home. But before that, I was wrapping up in Southeast Asia, and I purposely booked a little, bungalow on the beach in Thailand for like a week to do nothing. And it was funny because it was actually kind of a social place, and I was purposely like head down in my notebook, all this, like, I don't want to talk to anybody. And my whole point of being there was to just kind of soak it all in and process like what just happened, because it's been like 8 months. Surely I've learned a ton. I'm not the person I was when I started. Where do I go from here?
Right.
That was awful smart of me to do that. And it helped a lot
of foresight in that move. That's very fortuitous that you were able to plan that far ahead that way.
Yeah. And I don't know, I don't remember like someone having mentioned something that gave me the idea. Like, I don't know. I guess I just was enough aware of, like this has been a pretty significant piece of my life, phase of my life. And I want to ingest it and digest it a bit before because I knew as soon as I got home, like it just kind of snapped back into reality, and like it would be easy to just let it all just kind of float away.
Well, and what's funny, I find as well, is that sometimes you don't even really get the chance to share or debrief with others. That's one of the reasons why I love doing this podcast. And I'm going to imagine that you love doing yours as well because of that travel focus. And a lot of people don't want to hear about your travels. It's more like, did you have a good time? The answer needs to probably just be yes. And maybe there's space for you to share like one highlight.
Yeah. 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 Well, and not to mention when we're not talking about like a couple weeks trip, but like 8-9 months, like how would I even sum it up? Like so much had happened and I'd experienced so many ups and downs. And yeah, I definitely remember, except for a couple of my other friends who were, really on the same page in terms of their own love for travel.
Sure.
Yeah, I had very few conversations about it really. Or people would ask some random thing like, what was your favorite place? As I said before, I'm like, I love them all for different reasons. Like
I was going to say, yeah. I love that question because it's just like, seriously, you think after being gone for like 8.5 months that I can just give you the Cliff Notes version? Because there's no such thing.
Exactly.
But again, it's a version of inquiry and interest. It's just, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Actually, one thing that did help is that I was keeping a blog the whole time I was gone. Perfect. And so the people who cared would check in on the blog. And so actually, I think that is an upside in a way that when I came back, then people who had read the blog had something more concrete. They could say like, whoa, it sounds like you really had a hell of a time in India or whatever. Because they had some of the details that I was sharing along the way.
That's exactly it. Like it is, something that they are specifically curious about. So the blogging is great. The social media is great. And that makes sense because you were gone for such a long period of time. But what did that do in terms of, I'm not going to say necessarily shaping your experience, but possibly, did you find at all that you were living that experience for the sake of sharing it?
Interesting question. Yeah. And it's interesting because this was, 2004, 2005, before all of the social media stuff. But yes, even a blog can have some of that same effect. I do remember at times, sorry, another loud truck. I do remember at times that I would be out doing something. Like I remember I took this bike ride in Chile that was just like gorgeous day, stunning surroundings. And I was like describing the scenery in my head at like how I was going to write about it.
Okay.
Which, I mean, is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Nope. Like it made me very observant.
Yep.
And it's kind of like, that's one of the funny things about solo travel is that I actually think I was with a couple other people that I'd met, at the bike shop or whatever.
Sure.
But when you're traveling by yourself, if you're traveling with other people, you might be like, oh my God, look at this landscape. This is incredible. Yes. If I have no one to say that to, I think maybe the blog kind of, fit that role. And so I don't think I actually, like, for example, like, oh, I got to do this cool thing because then I can write about it. But I do remember having like kind of an awareness and an observation style, knowing that I was going to write about it later, for better or worse.
That makes a lot. No, that makes sense. And there's no good or bad about it. One of the things that I want people in general to just be aware of is, I'm going to try to say this the right way. We're not necessarily dealing with the millennial crowd who's all about making sure that their Instagram photo looks stunning and, all these exotic poses and things like that. That's not who my listeners are. So I know who I'm speaking to. But there's something to be said for when you're traveling solo. How do you stay connected? And how do you help other people understand sort of the journey that you're on? And how do you do it just for you?
Mm-hmm.
And that there's just a balance there that if people have never given that some thought, I encourage people to think about it as a way to say, well, why am I documenting this? And I'll tell you, I am the worst photographer and the worst writer when it comes to my travels. So the downside of that is that I don't have a lot of great record of my travels.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But I will tell you that when I'm in it, I'm fully immersed and engaged in it. So I take it for I'm the live in the moment and be really present kind of traveler. But people ask sometimes to see my photos. I would just put an article out in a magazine and they wanted my photos from a trip to New Zealand. And I'm like,
Uh-huh.
oh boy. Oh, and it was a struggle to search for the right pictures of the right quality that do or don't include me in them. But no matter what, it was, okay, there's a gap here. And in my role now, I probably should do better at that. But I don't love doing that stuff.
Right.
Okay, so before we run out of time though, because this conversation is going very quickly and I'm very much enjoying it, there was a little hint of additional story to come related to love.
Yes. So, and actually it's funny, when I was talking about it before, I kind of forgot about this part, but I actually met another guy I left on my, and that was interesting too, because when I met him, I'm like, you're awesome, but just so you know, I am taking this trip. Like, it is happening, and there's nothing you can do about it. So just so you know. And I lived in San Francisco. He lived in LA. And so, it was long distance from the beginning. And it is an interesting thing to bring up, I think, in the sense that so I still took the trip by myself, but it was up and down the entire time in terms of like, are we together? Are we just going to go do our own thing for now? And my opinion on that was constantly changing. And so I kind of cut cords, like maybe within the first month of travel. We had kind of said like, well, we're still quote unquote together. And maybe you can come meet me somewhere and, we'll just kind of see how it goes. Okay. And like within the first month, I remember just feeling, and it wasn't like I wanted to, fool around with everyone I met or whatever. I just was like, I think maybe I just need to really be on my own. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of just cut the cord, which he was really pissed about. Like, that's not fair. Like, you make this decision on your own. And anyway, so fast forward like 4 months, he actually came and met me in New York for New Year's when you came home. Okay. Yeah, which, so we were kind of like, oh, let's see what's going on. And then we decided, okay, we're like back together, which undoubtedly did make that departure harder. But I think it would have been hard even without that, as we talked about before, just like kind of the interruption and the coming back to like some other version of reality. Like, it was challenging no matter what. But when I left, I said, undoubtedly this is a life-changing experience and it's going to be really hard to describe. Actually, this ties in with what we were just talking about. And sure. I said, if this is going to work longer term, I really want you to come meet me somewhere and like experience part of this with me. Wow. And so he came to Vietnam. I guess that must have been like 3 or 4 months later. Came to Vietnam probably for like, 2 weeks or whatever vacation time he could get. And we actually had a really good experience. And so the short version of all that is I ended up moving to LA when I got back to the States because that's where he lived. Okay. And then we broke up like 4 months later.
That's still impressive though, right? Yeah. So, I mean, how did the time go together after you'd been traveling alone so long? And I know you had people with you during other parts of it. Mm-hmm. So you weren't like entirely 100% alone the whole time. But how did that go to have somebody back in your space more in that?
It was, actually, I remember this really clearly because my parents actually came right before him, maybe. Okay. And they actually overlapped briefly. And I remember from the beginning when my parents were planning to show up and they were like, do you want to go here? And how do you want to handle this? And I actually remember saying, I have been making every freaking decision for months and I will just do whatever you want to do.
Nice.
You decide where we're going to go, and I am happy to be along for the ride.
Nice.
Yeah. And so I think it went, to an extent, it was that way with him also, like, you can call the shots. You can decide where we're going to eat. You can decide where we're going to stay, because I'm sick and tired of having to make all of the decisions.
It is a lot of work.
So that was easy in a way. Yeah. To just hand it off for a little while.
I think that is one of the things that maybe people do underestimate about the solo travel, is so many people look at that like, so freeing, so much, so much freedom. Isn't that awesome?
Yeah.
And then you get to, it's so much responsibility. It's all on me. If something goes wrong, who am I depending on? Like,
Yeah.
And I think people forget that there's always two sides to the coin.
Yep.
So it is interesting, and I appreciate that you're bringing that up. So let's move on just a little bit more from that particular trip, because some of the work that you're doing now, and we don't have to get into the business side yet, but we can. But some of the work that you're doing now still is bringing all sorts of stuff up around travel. So how did you morph from, that trip to what your life is like now?
Right. Well, so going back to that, week on the beach in Thailand, when I was like, what's next? What do I want to do? What's important to me? One thing that was very clear is that I did not want to go back to an office. And so I was like, okay, how can I make that happen? Mm-hmm. And at the time, I was lucky in the sense that my previous career had been in book publishing. I'd worked for a number of book publishers in San Francisco. And luckily, it's an industry that relies on freelancers. I'd worked with freelancers. We had people all over the US. We even had an American living in Costa Rica who did copy editing for us.
Wow.
So I knew, I had the skills and I had the connections to basically just hang out my shingle as a freelancer. And so that was really what got the ball rolling. And I got back from the trip in late May and kind of, did some family stuff and bounced around a little bit. Picked up my stuff in San Francisco, moved to LA, and was officially open for business on August 1st, I remember. And yeah, like I said, because, all I had to do really was email everyone I knew and say, I'm available, please hire me. And I'm still doing that work 12 years later, almost 12 years.
That is awesome.
Yeah. And then it wasn't until, let's see, that was 2005, 6 years later that I started to look at, what else do I want to do? And this was a no-brainer because I knew I could make money right away, but maybe this isn't my life's work or whatever. And so that was where I started to think, this is the stuff I could talk about all day long, is travel and location independence and living abroad and all of it. And so, and I was living, that's a whole other thing we skipped. I was living in Argentina by that point. And because just that, I wanted to start something new where I could talk about this stuff. And so that was really the initiative for Nomadtopia. And I've been doing, so now I do both and, have my time a bit split between the two. But just, having been so clear about I've got to find a way to have the flexibility that I've come to enjoy on this trip. Like, how do I keep the adventure and the freedom part of my life?
Absolutely. And it really, it's mission critical really to make those decisions and then to be aware that there is actually a way. And as I've continued to record more episodes of this show, I keep finding people who continue to get more and more creative as they, again, so many people in a traditional situation think this is what travel looks like. This is what being a digital nomad looks like. This is what a life that involves travel is. And once you sit down and decide for yourself what makes sense for you, there's all sorts of ways to create it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think really what got kind of planted that seed for me, and this is also one of the great things about travel. And now, of course, we have podcasts and all these other things to help. But I met a bunch of people who, like you just said, have found really creative ways. Like I met a woman from London. I met her on a boat in Thailand. And she said, yep, Like 5 years ago, I decided I'm never spending another winter in London. And I just set up my life so I can come here or somewhere warm every winter. And I was like, oh, brilliant. Like what a concept that you could just figure out a way. And, she found like more seasonal type work and so on and set it up so it worked for her. And then I met an American guy who was teaching English, bouncing around Asia, hadn't been back to the States in like 15 years or something. And those are just two of the people I remember, and it was constantly just opening up that sense of possibility and creativity and like, whoa, if I could really kind of, break out of this kind of limited box that the 9-to-5, status quo has put me in, what would this look like? What does my ideal life really look like?
That is exactly it. And as you make those decisions, the opportunities become much more clear, because otherwise we're looking at all the possibilities. And what we really need to do is focus on those that match us most appropriately.
Totally.
So tell us a little bit more about Nomadtopia and the work that you do, and make sure that people understand where to find you and how to connect.
Yeah. So it is, I really think of it as like a hub of resources and community. I have a Facebook group. You can just search Nomadtopia Community on Facebook to connect, like-minded people. A lot of times when you tell people back home what you want to do, they think you're totally crazy. So this group is to find people who, don't think you're crazy. And I have some online courses. I do one-on-one coaching. And then, as you mentioned before, I have my podcast as well. So nomadtopia.com is really the hub for all of those things.
That's awesome. So we will include all of those links in the show notes as well, so people can connect with you and find you. But otherwise, I really encourage people to tune into other like-minded podcasts. And certainly, I appreciate that we are finding other podcasters out there trying to share some of these stories. There's not a ton out there on the subject matter that we're covering.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important that we're getting it out there, getting the message out and sharing it. Cool. Well, again, I truly appreciate you taking the time to share your stories with us. I'm going to ask for one final nugget of brilliance because of the work that you're doing right now. I'm going to be specific, and not just about solo travel, but actually like taking that leap into nomadic life of sorts. Is there something that you find that is the one thing that's holding people back? And what would you tell them to get past it?
Great question. Well, what I think is really important, really ties in with what you were just talking about, is that there's no one way to do it. I hear so many people say like, well, I'm not a real nomad, or like, I'm a bad nomad, or like random stuff. It doesn't matter. Like these days I spend 5, 6, 7 months in one place. Some people might say that doesn't count or something. But it doesn't matter. It's about finding what really works for you. Absolutely. And maybe it's just, like my friend from London, going somewhere warm in the winter. Maybe you want to give up everything and travel nonstop all the time, or something in the middle. It's absolutely up to you. And I think it's really important to not get sucked into, as you mentioned, Jennifer, some of the, like pretty Instagram lifestyles and what have you, and think there's only one way or that's the right way. It's really just about finding what you want and what works well for you and going that direction.
Absolutely. And I think we can all take that moment and think about, if we could do something different and include travel just a little bit more in our lives than what we do right now, what might that possibly be? And use your imagination. It does not have to fit somebody else's version of what it's supposed to or should.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Amy, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wasn't it great to hear the stories that Amy shared with us today? Take a moment to remember that there's not one way to do solo travel. You can create it and make this whatever you want it to be. If you love these stories and want to help support Go Solo Live, you can do that by making a donation to the show. There's lots of options and some great gifts of appreciation when you go to www.patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Go Solo Live, all one word, to show some love about the show. Well, we've reached the end of today's episode, but the conversation doesn't have to end there. You can always find me on Facebook at Transform Via Travel, or you can find out more about the show and upcoming episodes on Go Solo Live on Twitter. If you're interested in being a guest, don't hesitate to reach out to Jennifer at transformviatravel.com. And until next time, remember, go solo, not alone.